Up, okay?
Yeah. Okay, Ed, I think we can begin.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm Ed Gabriel, President of the American Task Force for Lebanon. And together with my colleague, Paul Salem, the President of the Middle East Institute, we'll be moderating today's session. We look forward to a productive and expansive conversation over the next hour with many of you that are on this call today. We'll be taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature, which you'll find on the screen. Please submit your questions at any time throughout the event, and we'll make sure to take as many as possible. For those of you joining us on live stream or by phone, submit your questions by emailing events@mei.edu. That's events@mei.edu. Let me give you a short history of where we've been and how we've come to today's meeting. During the past 18 months, MEI and ATFL have been convening a group of prominent experts concerning the future of the U.S.-Lebanon relationship. About last fall, in October 2019, at the beginning of the protests in Lebanon, the dialogue became even more urgent in examining the acute economic, social, political issues of the country and how U.S. policy and its leadership might be of greater assistance in supporting Lebanon's stability, while encouraging positive socio-economic and governance reform. Then the COVID pandemic came along and accelerated this crisis and further underscores the timeliness of publishing a policy report outlining U.S. interests in Lebanon and ways in which the U.S. could help the Lebanese during these very challenging times. Let me say that the report represents the most comprehensive, up-to-date thinking concerning the U.S.-Lebanon bilateral relationship. But I have to say that the recommendations are framed by two existing assumptions: that a Lebanese government and its citizens will advance reform proposals that meet the requirements of the international community for economic assistance, and that other forms of U.S. aid are an unconditional and an immediate priority, such as support for the LAF, a reform-minded civil society, universities, refugees and their host communities, and poverty relief. But if the past is any indication, these assumptions that I just mentioned are likely to change in the weeks and months ahead, depending on events in both the US and Lebanon. MEI and ATFL are therefore committed to continuing this dialogue starting tomorrow morning and issuing an updated report in time for the next presidential administration, regardless of who wins the next election. We hope this report and our follow-on reports at the end of the year will contribute to policies to sustain strong US-Lebanon relations built on shared values and interests. Now, the report does not represent the views of MEI or ATFL as institutions, but rather a consensus among a group of US-Lebanon experts whom the two institutions convened. At this time, let me acknowledge the significant contribution of the Lebanese International Finance Executives, LIFE as it's known, the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, LCPS, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, and experts from the US and Lebanon who shared their comments and insights with us, the names of whom you can see at the end of the report. There are probably over 50 names there. The principal experts include Les Campbell, Paul Salem, Marcel Waba, Gerald Fierstein, Hisham Melham, Rhonda Slim, Mona Yakubian, and myself. And of course, our editor of this report is Jean Abinader. I'd like now, if I may, to introduce our next speaker and great friend of the US-Lebanon relationship.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to say something about this wonderful man. Congressman Darren LaHood, born and raised in Peoria, has served the constituents of the 18th District of Illinois, which spans 19 counties across central and western Illinois. Darren is also co-chair of the US-Lebanon Friendship Caucus, which now boasts over 20 members. He serves on the powerful and oldest House committee, the Committee on Ways and Means, which is responsible for taxation, trade, and tariffs, and also serves on the US Joint Economic Committee. Darren's a third generation Peorian, which I should say was Abe Lincoln's old district, sometime before Darren took over, earned a BA from Loras College and holds a JD from John Marshall Law. Last year, Congressman LaHood, with his wife, Kristen, led an ATFL sponsored congressional trip to Lebanon with his colleagues, Donna Shalala and Garrett Graves. And it was just before the demonstrations took place. As a matter of fact, they saw the beginnings of those. It's now my honor to welcome our guest, Congressman LaHood. Thank you. Darren?
Well, Ambassador Gabriel, thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks for having me on today. And let me just acknowledge ATFL and MEI and LIFE for all your work in helping to put together this very important Lebanon policy report. It couldn't come at a more critical time with what's going on in Lebanon and the US-Lebanese relationship. As you mentioned, Ambassador, I am honored to serve as the co-chair of the US-Lebanese Friendship Caucus in the House of Representatives. We are up to 26 members, bipartisan, that every day we are working to educate members of Congress and the House and Senate on the importance of Lebanon, the importance of the relationship, and constantly striving to raise those issues with our fellow members. And you mentioned the district that I represent, and I've been home. I'm in Peoria today, but I'm proud to represent over 8,000 Lebanese families in Peoria, Illinois. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've had over the last several weeks with friends and relatives of Lebanese heritage that are so distraught and saddened about what's going on in Lebanon. And so, you know, those are my constituents. They watch LBC and follow what's going on a daily basis, and they know what's happening. And it is tragic in some ways to see what's transpired over the last 8 to 10 months in terms of the free fall of the economy in Lebanon and how the middle class has been affected by that. And so there is so many reasons why this report is important today. And I will say this, so many times in Washington, D.C., we get mixed messages on what we should be doing in Lebanon. You get different opinions from different people. And what I love about this report, and I had an opportunity to read it yesterday and look at it again this morning, it is comprehensive, it is impactful, it lays out specific recommendations on what we ought to be doing in Lebanon in terms of reform, in terms of fighting corruption, in terms of taking on Hezbollah, in terms of supporting the LAF. And so these are concrete solutions. It builds a narrative on what we ought to do. And that consensus that you have put together, you and Dr. Salem and others, is really what we need at this critical juncture. So I'm very supportive of what you've done here. Now it is our job to work in the Congress, to work within the administration, to continue to talk to people and educate people and build that narrative on how important the relationship with Lebanon is to the United States, how it is in our national interest to continue to support the LAF and work to bring Lebanon back. And as we all know, this is a moment of crisis, but it is a moment of opportunity. And we need to work with Lebanon to help them make those reforms and all the things that we know that are necessary, because we are on the brink. we are on the precipice here in Lebanon. And so, again, I'm honored to be a part of this call. I look forward to questions and comments and look forward to working with my colleagues in a bipartisan way to continue to support Lebanon in every possible way. And our ultimate goal, as everybody knows, because we share this wonderful heritage of Lebanon, is an independent, prosperous, and secure Lebanon. Thank you for having me on today, Ambassador Gabriel.
Well, thank you, Congressman. I should say that you've been a very active co-chairman of the U.S.-Lebanon Friendship Caucus. And for that, we thank you dearly. I know that you'll have some new actions coming out pretty soon. And I think it'll dovetail this report very well. We really appreciate you taking this concern head on. Thank you very much. I'd now like to turn the program over to our partner, advisor, and friend, Dr. Paul Salem, the president of the Middle East Institute. Paul?
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Ambassador Gabriel, and thank you, Congressman Lahoud. It's been, first of all, great pleasure to work with the American Task Force for Lebanon as the Middle East Institute here in Washington, D.C., and also to work with the LIFE organization represented today by Mr. Paul Rafael, who I will introduce in a short while. I agree that this report comes at a very, very critical time for Lebanon, given all the economic and political and social crises that Lebanon is going through. And I would say for the US as well, which is going through a very historic set of crises itself, in addition to coming up to critical presidential and congressional elections in November. So I think this report couldn't come at a better time. This report obviously is focused on the US-Lebanese relationship for obvious reasons, given ATFL's focus and where we reside in Washington. But I dare say a lot of the points that it makes and the arguments that it puts forward apply also more generally to the international community. I know that governments in Europe and others in Asia are very interested that Lebanon find a way forward, that Lebanon not go over the precipice completely, but the international community, as Ambassador Gabriel said, needs Lebanon to help itself so that the international community can help it. Ambassador Gabriel asked me to make a few sort of comments on the political situation, which I will do. I'll start by saying that really the crisis we're going through today is the accumulated result of the last 3 decades of poor governance and poor leadership, where we've evolved a political class, much of which came from the Civil War of 75 to 1990, that entered positions of dominance in the government and created levels of corruption and patronage system that has really bankrupted the country to a large degree, and also 30 years of poor fiscal and economic planning or economic management, which relied tremendously on accumulation of debt and running a budget deficit, something that my colleague Mr. Rafael will talk about in more detail. But this is not a crisis that was born in 2019 or that was triggered by one minor event here or there. It's really a crisis of what you might call the Lebanese Second Republic after the Ta'if Agreement. We are now in a crisis of 3 dimensions. There is obviously a massive multi-dimensional economic crisis, which is the economy itself contracting in a tragic way, the national currency losing much of its value, the banks effectively bankrupt, and the government itself effectively bankrupt as well. So a multiple layered economic crisis. We have a political crisis in the sense which might have positive aspects, in the sense that there was a public uprising in October, and there's still a massive mood of discontent in the country and demands for positive political change, and that political challenge is ongoing. And thirdly, we now have a massive social crisis because poverty levels are shooting up and moving past 50% of the population. Unemployment is also skyrocketing. Hunger has become a reality and a real threat for many, many Lebanese. this social crisis requires urgent attention, obviously from the Lebanese government, but from the international community as well. Where we are now is at an uncertain moment. We have a government in place which has promised a lot but done very, very little. Effectively, it does not have the capacity, the real power to execute actual reform changes. The only thing that the government, and one might say the ruling class, has stood by and watched is the collapse of the national currency, which has massive effects socially and economically. This government might be short-lived. There already is talk potentially of a new government to try another start at trying to handle this crisis and maybe having a more serious approach to the IMF. But until any real reforms are implemented, that avenue is largely going to be blocked. Another dynamic that is important to keep an eye on is the social, call it the protest movement, the uprising. Some people in Arabic call it the Hirak. That is a very promising movement, but it has a big challenge in front of it in order to coordinate or unify its effort, strategize and mobilize in order to have a much more impactful voice in the formation of governments and decision-making and agendas of what governments actually do, and more importantly, in the longer term, mobilizing for and challenging the ruling class in the elections, hopefully that will happen in 2022. I'll end with what worries me most acutely, and that is the risk of state collapse in Lebanon. We've already talked about the massive social distress that the population is going through, and that might get worse in the weeks ahead. But when we look at the state, putting the government aside for a while, what has kept stability in Lebanon to a large degree and what's been the backbone of maintaining stability in the country has been the role of the Lebanese army and the internal security forces, which I think have played a very positive role in maintaining stability even during the political and economic crisis. But as the salaries of the army and the internal security forces disappear, dwindle into meaninglessness, there is a risk that the army and the internal security forces will no longer be there, and that Lebanon might collapse as a state, like it did in 1975, like other states have collapsed as well, and that we might be in a very long-term risky situation where people again resort to arms and militias and cantons as happened before. I sincerely wish that does not happen, but I think that lends an air of extreme urgency to our deliberations today and any policy decisions moving forward. I will stop there, and I'll turn to introducing my good friend and one of our collaborators in this effort, Mr. Paul Rafael. Paul has a long and very distinguished career in the field of finance. Obviously, like most of us, he's Lebanese and of Lebanese origin, and although he lives abroad, he's currently the executive chairman of UBS, and he was the founding chairman of LIFE, the group that we mentioned before, and he's here to share with us some of his thoughts about the multi-layered economic crisis in Lebanon, and some thoughts about moving forward. And many of those ideas are in the report itself. So Paul, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Paul. An honor to participate. I'll try to keep it short and relatively structured, as a lot of you have become quite familiar, I think, with the root causes of the current crisis. In terms of the backdrop, as Paul said, at its core, this really stems from an issue of flawed governance of the country, flawed decision-making, which then enables abuse, enables leaders to coalesce around decisions that perhaps are self-serving and not serving the greater good. So that manifested itself in economic terms into two chronic deficits, which averaged between 10 and 20% over the last 15 years, namely a budget deficit of 10 to 15% a year, which would be obviously anathema to most countries, most economists, and a current account deficit where the imports of the country were multiple times the exports for the country. Now those two twin deficits were papered over and were able to last as long as they did, principally for two reasons. One, the remittances of the diaspora, which found themselves in the banking system and were recycled into financing the government for longer than should have been the case, and flawed monetary policies that enabled those banks and the Lebanese central bank to fund the government and to expose themselves to a single issuer which was increasingly in tenuous credit worthiness. So that's kind of the backdrop. In 2017, Life issued a comprehensive report calling for an emergency comprehensive solution to the country. That was 3 years ago. We went to see the usual suspects, the three presidents, the finance minister, the central bank governor. And although they nodded and acquiesced, little was done, as we all know. We turned up the heat over the last 3 years, which then took precedence by, as Paul Salem said, by the street. The street started its own action October 17th of last year. Coincidentally, on October 17th, we issued a very comprehensive scathing report as to what was not being done and what should be done. Since then, the government of Hassan Diab, to their credit, did issue for the first time in the country's 2 decades of tenuous policies, a comprehensive report. We feel that the report of the government that came out, I believe, in April of this year, had some encouraging aspects, which gave us maybe some hope. Firstly, it was comprehensive for the first time. Secondly, it included credible attempts at making some sacrifices on the fiscal side. Number 3, it was a first attempt at quantifying the imbalances. Number 4, there was a recognition that over time that we needed a more flexible exchange rate in the country. It justifiably called for a full and independent audit of the Lebanese central bank. It did, for the first time, call for an IMF program, and it did mention the need for a social safety net. So those were the 6 or 7 encouraging points. We felt, however, in the report and our reaction to that statement or that plan, that it was still lacking in specificity in a number of areas, which I will not maybe detail, but there were, just to name 3, there was no mention of any a political restructuring. There was no mention of sufficient detail on the fiscal adjustments, which will in any case require a reduction in public sector employment and public sector salaries. There was no mention of any privatization program. And there was largely a requirement in the plan to ascribe a very disproportionate loss of to the banking sector, which we all know no economy can function with a decrepit banking sector. There are a few others other comments which I can skip over, but we felt that it was a good step forward, but not sufficient. To our great dismay, since March, April, and since this plan came out, even on the 7 points that we thought were encouraging, we have seen very little progress. And it's mostly this inaction that we have found, frankly, irresponsible and quite disturbing. it's increasingly clear that it's not as it might have been in the past due to lack of acknowledgement of the losses or lack of understanding of what the solutions might be, but to the best way I can describe it, either political paralysis, policy paralysis, or some people might say deliberate apathy. So with that, I will stop here, Paul, and happy to answer any further questions you might have now or later, but I just wanted to keep it brief because I know there's a lot to cover.
Thank you, Paul. That was very, very helpful. We do have a sort of a discussion Q&A session at the end, which Ambassador Gabriel will moderate. So I'm sure there'll be questions to you, Paul. Thank you very much. Let me turn to another good friend, Ms. Mona Yacoubian. Mona has been, well, a champion, among other things, a champion for Lebanon in Washington for many, many years, and ran a Lebanon working group, and really has been deeply engaged with Lebanon here in the US for many, many years. She's also worked both in government at USAID in programs that very much directly impact Lebanon and Syria and so on, so knows that side of things intimately, and has also held various positions in think tanks around Washington, D.C., and she was invaluable in helping put this report together. So Mona, over to you for your thoughts.
Great, thanks so much, Paul, for that kind introduction. And I want to thank you for your leadership on this project. And Congressman Lahoud, it's a real honor to be on the panel with you. What I want to do is pick up exactly where Paul Rafael left off. And that is really to sort of look a little bit more deeply at some of the social dimensions of the financial crisis, and then try and understand better what those impacts mean, not only for Lebanon, but also for US interests. So let me start by saying very quickly that, in short, Lebanon is really hurtling toward becoming a failed state. Increasingly, we are hearing comparisons of Lebanon to Venezuela. And unfortunately, I think those comparisons are very apt. But I would argue in some ways, Lebanon actually may be a worse case than Venezuela, because Lebanon is not blessed with natural resources. It doesn't have oil. Its greatest resource is its human capital, is the Lebanese people themselves, and the dynamism that they bring. And unfortunately, it's the Lebanese people who are now suffering the most as a result of this crisis. I want to just lay out in a little more detail some of the impacts. Paul touched on a few of them, but I think it really bears repeating. This debt crisis, which has coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic and then the associated lockdown measures, has really, in a sense, those lockdown measures essentially, I think, accelerated and deepened both the economic and now social meltdown that we are witnessing in Lebanon. The statistics themselves are staggering. There have really, the Lebanese people have suffered, I would say, devastating impacts already. Let me tick off just a few. The lira devaluation, which is, I believe it's devalued by more than 80% since October of 2019, has led to inflation that's estimated to be 55%. Some food items have seen as high as 200% inflation. And this is what's giving rise to hunger in Lebanon, and even the specter of famine, which is really almost unheard of, at least in modern history. Unemployment is now estimated to be 40%, and it's probably higher amongst Lebanon's youth. Lebanon's once fairly healthy middle class is increasingly being thrust into poverty, as Paul noted, poverty rates as high as 50%, and potentially those rates could go higher. We're also seeing already increasing signs of desperation in the Lebanese population. There have been reports of suicides as a result of the devastating economic impacts people are feeling, increased lawlessness and crime. There have been electricity cuts. Lebanon is no stranger to electricity cuts, but now it's reported that Beirut is having as many as 22 hours of cuts of electricity as a result of fuel shortages. So the country is clearly suffering through a major crisis. What I want to reiterate, though, is that as we are witnessing Lebanon collapse, the stakes could not be higher for the United States. As Paul noted, Lebanese stability has long been a key national security interest for the US. And in the very brief time I have left, what I'd like to do, though, is highlight a very important, and I would argue often under-recognized role that Lebanon plays. And that is a country that hosts refugees. Lebanon hosts the highest number of refugees per capita in the world. The vast majority are Syrian. They fled the brutal conflict happening next door in Syria. And I would argue this is actually an important international public good that Lebanon is providing, particularly given the reluctance and even potentially refusal of countries in the West to host refugees. Now, for the most part, the conditions of Syrian refugees in Lebanon have not been great. Unfortunately, I think those conditions are poised to get significantly worse as the country continues to fall into a deeper crisis. As the Lebanese become more impoverished, more desperate, unfortunately, I think Syrian refugees are poised to potentially bear the brunt of that. They may feel compelled to leave, or even worse, could be forced to leave, which would be a contravention of international humanitarian law, which calls for the safe, voluntary, and dignified return of refugees. All of this happening at a time when international appeals for refugee assistance are chronically underfunded. So we're at a very difficult moment for Lebanon. And before turning it over to my colleague Jean, let me just underscore, I think, a couple of key points. One is, I think it's going to be critical for the US to maintain, if not increase, its assistance both to Syrian refugees in Lebanon and the Lebanese communities who are hosting them. The US should also think about increasing its food aid to impoverished Lebanese. This is a country whose social safety net is essentially failing. I want to reference in closing a remark that Congressman Lahoud made about at times hearing mixed messages about Lebanon. This is not the time for mixed messages. We are really, I think Lebanon is at an inflection point, and it is going to be a critical time for cohesive, unified US engagement on Lebanon. And let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Mona, thank you very, very much for those remarks and emphasizing why it's so important to help Lebanon, obviously, all the time, while encouraging the Lebanese government to implement the right reforms. I think it's also useful to just consider the alternative condition if the state collapses, and if you have a failed state on the Eastern Mediterranean, you have, the renewed likelihood of not only Syrian refugees, but maybe Lebanese refugees moving west. You have open territory for armed groups, militias and terrorist groups to really set up shop in Lebanon. So it's a real nightmare that certainly the Lebanese want to avoid. But as you say, it is an international public good that Lebanon move forward, but that Lebanon also survive. So thank you for all of that, Mona. Let me turn to our good friend, Jean Abinader. Jean Abinader is really the guy who put this, who drafted the first draft of this report, interacted with all of the various team members and experts, and produced patiently draft after draft until we have this excellent report that we have before us. He is the editor of this report. Jean is the policy director for the American Task Force for Lebanon, and he's the principal and founder of Abinader Advisory Services here in the US. So Jean, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I want to thank both Ed and Paul for giving me this opportunity to work on a project that is both professionally and personally enriching. It's not often we Lebanese Americans have the opportunity to really speak to policies that can help our literally home of heritage. But this is hopefully, as Ed said, a beginning to a process where we can affect strong recommendations to the next administration. Also want to express my thanks to the other experts and those we acknowledge in the front and the back of the paper who contributed much to our understanding of US-Lebanon relations and options for moving forward. And of course, we couldn't have come this far without the staff, both at MEI and at ATFL, Leslie Tuma, our executive director, and Kristen Kutab, who's our manager, to really help us make sure that we were on track and keep this thing going. Finally, I want to thank Deep Kimi for his initial research on the paper, MEI and LCPS for their outstanding analyses that have really enriched and helped us move forward, and Life for helping parse the competing visions of the economic roots of the crisis and options for resurrecting Lebanon, even at this late date. The US has enduring interest in Lebanon, as both Paul and Mona have said. We share values and interests that go beyond diplomatic relations. Lebanon survives because of its commitment to coexistence of diverse peoples, belief in democracy, however imperfect, and regional stability. The US cannot afford a failed state in the Eastern Mediterranean, as Paul said, which would unleash more terrorism and migration in the region. As importantly and increasingly challenging, the US must counter encroachment by Iran, Russia, and China if it is to protect its interests and friends in the region. We are under no illusions. Although we assign a significant role for US global leadership in our recommendations, we recognize that Lebanon is unfortunately viewed through the prism of Iran's goals in the region, courtesy of its support for Hezbollah. While this is helpful in terms of gaining the attention of some US policymakers, it limits creativity for innovating policy options that are outside of the US-Iran conflict. And we are under no illusion concerning the current leadership in Lebanon beyond Hezbollah. None of them have demonstrated the resolve and courage needed when it comes to seriously addressing the basic issues of misgovernance, corruption, and all the other recommendations and issues mentioned by my colleagues. As to our recommendations, they begin by recognizing the need for a unifying vision among the Lebanese. The US will provide more robust and defined leadership to Lebanon's cause. We have been counseled only if the Lebanese demonstrate their commitment and actions to undertake reforms that are well known across the sectors we've discussed. The US, we recommend, can then take the initiative to work with the International Support Group and Lebanon's friends around the world to work within the IMF guidelines to support progress by the government. As Ed and others have mentioned, key issues of immediate concern are strengthening the social safety net and injecting liquidity into the banking system within an agreement between the government of Lebanon and the international donor community. The plan we propose contains a number of recommendations of steps to be taken by the government of Lebanon, many of which you have already heard today. These encompass actions to take immediately and in the coming year to rebuild confidence in the country, which is sadly lacking on many levels. In summary, US policies, which include supporting IMF restructuring, strengthening the social safety net, and undertaking social and political reforms that put people of Lebanon first, must consider the following. The best strategy for assisting Lebanese armed forces sustain their current high levels of professionalism, despite the pain being felt by the troops and their families from the economic crisis. The US should consider PL 480 and other programs to combat the growing levels of poverty and dislocation in the country by providing humanitarian assistance directly to the Lebanese people. The US should continue its support for Syrian and other refugees in Lebanon, as well as the host communities that are under great stress. The US should continue to work with UNIFIL to support its mission and enable it to have more freedom of movement in its work with the LAF to control territory in the south. UNIFIL's tripartite meetings with Lebanese and Israeli military leaders have been a vital force for maintaining peace along the border for the past 14 years. The official US-Lebanon relationship has endured for more than 70 years, and our ties go back more than 150 years. This is not the time for the US to look away from or look past Lebanon. The US is still a critical force for stability and security in the region, and Lebanon can once again be a valuable partner. And Ed, I'd like to turn it over to you for questions and answers. With your mic on.
Paul, did you want to say anything in conclusion before I take the Q&A?
No, I thank all the panelists, and we turn it over to you, Ed, for the Q&A.
Okay, well, we do not have a shy audience. We are inundated with questions, which is a good thing. And I'm going to read the first one from Gina Shamus. Corruption has been at the core of all the problems, and it's aggravated now by the impact of the revolution, the intentional let go of the lira without a well-deserved transition plan, and topped by COVID-19. To what extent is the US seriously ready to support fighting corruption in Lebanon, as well as a serious change in the current leadership? Whoever wants to take that on, who wants to go first? I'm sure there's a couple of you.
Well, maybe I'll take a stab at it, but I mean, it is a kind of also a question on the US side, but I mean, my reading is the responsibility, like in any country, lies with the people of that country, the people of Lebanon. And it's a very important development that much of the Lebanese public rose up in October 2019 exactly against corruption and mismanagement and the performance of this ruling class. That is the main engine of change to my mind. And as I said, I think the main responsibility for us in Lebanon is to organize, mobilize, strategize. Other countries have gone through this as well, whether you look at Ukraine or Argentina or Mexico or many other countries, how to turn a spontaneous public leaderless protest movement into a sustained political movement that provides a real alternative to the population. I think, speaking here from where I am in Washington and the international community, I think it's not the role of external powers to pick parties or pick winners or losers in another country, but it's legitimate to say these are the types of reforms, and obviously eliminating corruption is the first and most important one. These are the conditions, whether implemented by this government or a revolutionary or reform movement, those are the conditions where then the US and the international community would be happy to provide more support. So yes, I think that is where the US and other countries, friends of Lebanon, would stand, and they're saying it openly.
Jean or Mona?
I'm happy to jump in for just a moment. I mean, I think there's been longstanding concern on the part of the US government about corruption in Lebanon. And in many ways, that has dictated how our assistance flows to the country, which is not directly to the government, precisely because of concerns over corruption. I think if anything, what we need to do is continue to fund and maybe enhance funding for civil society organizations that focus on transparency and really, frankly, holding various elements of the Lebanese government to account and insisting on there being greater transparency and accountability. And the Lebanese, there's a very vibrant civil society sector, so it's not for lack of talent in that area. The other thing I would underscore is with COVID-19, I think we need to be very cognizant of the fact that unfortunately, these divisions, perhaps the differences between rich and poor, if anything, are going to be amplified. And with that, I think elements of wealth inequality, income inequality should be front and center. And finally, measures that are being put in place to address the social issues in the country should not be vulnerable to corruption and corrupt practices. I think in an excellent panel that Paul hosted last week, it was raised that some of the measures are already being put in place in terms of noting goods that are being subsidized, et cetera, that the way it's being done is unfortunately business as usual and is in fact opening up for greater corruption. So these are the kinds of practices that have to be called out and stopped.
Jean or Paul, did you want to add to this?
No, thank you, Ed. I think that was well addressed.
The only thing I want to add is a point that Paul Salem has made over and over again, and Mona as well, and other colleagues. Like in the United States, people who hold office tend to get reelected. And the Lebanese, for many years, because of the way the system is set up, rely on their warlord leaders for their jobs, for their salaries, for their ability to get health care, et cetera, et cetera. And so they keep returning these people back. They keep supporting these people. October changed that calculus. And we hope that that continues forward, that the demonstrations, that the opposition as it forms and coalesces continues to be cross-sectarian, cross-geography, that really represents the Lebanese as a people, as opposed to Lebanese who continue to have the sectarian identity, which keeps them from unifying and changing the government.
Ed, if I may just add to what was said, I agree with Mona. I think tying aid to an independent judiciary and a corrupt-free judiciary is very important in those other civil institutions in Lebanon. I would also point out we are all aware of corruption in Lebanon, and it's a constant refrain that we talk about. But there's no examples of anybody that's been prosecuted or held accountable for public corruption. I don't know that anybody on this call today can name somebody that's been held out as an example. And so you got to start somewhere with that. And I know there's been criticism of the US government with using the Mazinski Act and also using sanctions. And some of that gets to other issues related to financial theft, but we got to start somewhere, and you got to lay out an example and set the tone. That's what prosecution is all about, is deterring bad behavior. And so sooner rather than later, Lebanon needs to take accountability and move forward.
You know, a related question to you, Darren, has come up from Catherine Betruni. Has the ATFL or the U.S. Lebanon Friendship Caucus discussed investing in infrastructure and non-governmental institutions as a counter to Hezbollah? You might want some of your colleagues to answer that or take a shot at it yourself.
Well, the answer is yes. The problem is that I don't know that there's a lot of private sector dollars that want to flow into Lebanon with the current situation the way it is. You know, when you're putting private sector dollars somewhere, there's a risk. There's always a risk. And with the current situation in Lebanon, again, Paul and others that are in the financial world can maybe talk a little further about that. But it's not a risk worth taking when you have a corrupt, dysfunctional government. Yeah, in another example where maybe we had been making progress, I think there is an avenue and an opportunity. Clearly, there are plenty of infrastructure projects that are sorely needed in Lebanon, whether those are tunnels or roads or bridges or ports that could function very well. But again, you got to have the atmosphere, the right atmosphere to invest that money.
Thank you. And she also makes reference to non-governmental institutions. Does anyone want to further address this question?
Maybe I'll pick it up, Ed. Maybe as Congressman Lahoud had mentioned, I think it goes back to the root cause, which is governance. Money flows where there's trust, credibility, and the rule of law. And there is no such thing today in Lebanon. So money is unlikely to go to any such organizations. And the second part of the question, unfortunately, even unions, even many educational institutions, and some, if not most, private sector institutions have become politicized in Lebanon. So the credibility of most organizations locally that could, even in a good governance scenario, act as a conduit for a private sector investment, today are really unable to play that role, sadly, because they've been infiltrated by the political forces that are very, very smart at doing this in the country.
Thank you. Another question from Jerry Bass. Do we not already have a failed state with Hezbollah controlling the military, the militia, I should say, and they're stronger than anyone else there, and the state, and they have control of the government now. So is it already failed?
Well, I'll take that. No, it is a compromised state. It is a state that doesn't have sovereignty, certainly not full sovereignty. It controls much of its borders, but not all, controls much of its internal territory, but much of it does not. There is a major armed group, obviously Hezbollah, which does not answer to the Lebanese government or the Lebanese people and is allied and supported by Iran. Those are the facts. It is hence in a middle ground. It is not a full failed state, would be the scenario we described, which would be one in which particularly the army and the internal security forces, which maintain order and convey or impose the state's authority in most territories of the country. If that were to fall away, and hungry, desperate Lebanese would go either to their local communities, form militias, form gangs, as happened to some degree in 1975, and the country really ceased to have any central authority. That is a full failed state in which you'd have the conditions we described. The Lebanese army is not controlled by Hezbollah. There are obviously, it's a complicated situation, but anybody who knows the Lebanese army leadership, the Lebanese Corps of officers, and knows them well, knows that they are the most integrated national institution in the country. They have their own esprit de corps and their own agenda. It's very clear to the government, to the army, and to the Lebanese that for the Lebanese army to attempt to confront Hezbollah in any military sense would immediately lead to a complete civil war, which is not what any Lebanese wants. So the Lebanese army does have some difficulties with Hezbollah in some areas where they have to take that into account, and that's unfortunate. And that's what many of us and others, and even many in the Army Command, are trying to overcome. But they also have to worry about the stability of the country. So the Lebanon is a compromised state, is in a very bad shape, but a completely failed state would be 10 times worse than what we see today, and very dangerous for the Lebanese and for the region and the world.
Thank you, Paul. We've got many questions. One that keeps coming up is, where can I get the report? You can go to mei.edu or atfl.org after this meeting. It'll go online after this meeting. We have
Well, let me also interject, Ed, that for those who are on the Zoom call, the whole report is posted on the chat function. So it's right there in front of you if you're on the Zoom. If you're following on YouTube, then yes, you have to go either to the MEI website or the ATFL website.
Thank you. We have two questions that are similar from Osama Hassanian and Zeneb Shatila. In a nutshell, what are the steps for immediate assistance to ease the hunger, avoid the famine, help with education, employment, and healthcare? So the poor and middle income.
Maybe Mona, you want to take a first stab at that?
I can take a first stab, and I know Jean has done quite a bit of thinking and writing on this. But I think essentially it's some of the points that we've laid out. And there are assistance accounts, in particular this PL 480 that Jean has mentioned, which is food aid, that is expressly designed to provide to impoverished populations that are experiencing hunger, using, I believe, surplus U.S. agricultural products. So this is exactly the kind of assistance that should be positioned to go into place. In addition, I should say there's a long-standing history of U.S. assistance to the education sector in Lebanon. It's really, in some ways, when I was at AID, it was among the most impressive of the programs that I worked on. And I think this is precisely what needs to happen. I mean, this is assistance that is essentially helping to strengthen Lebanon's public education sector, which has long lagged, and many Lebanese of means were able to afford private education. Public education is key. And in addition, assistance to important institutions of higher education like AUB like the Lebanese American University, which really form a very important role in helping to cultivate Lebanon's, as I said initially, Lebanon's most important asset, which is its human capital. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm sure Jean has other comments to add.
We have a
Jean,
lot
you're
of
mute.
questions, Ed, so you might want to just move on.
No, go ahead, Jean. I think it's important. This is a very much across the board question.
I
We've got about,
think Lebanese Americans should be, and maybe Darren can, Congressman, can help us with this. I think the Lebanese Americans should be very proud of what their government has done to date in terms of its support for the LAF and support for it. We're the largest contributor to support for the Syrian refugees. We actually pay our pledges, which makes us different from 2/3 of the rest of the world who make pledges at donor conferences and don't then give money. But it's a good question. You know, what else can we do? We have to personally ourselves. ATFL has a project that we're putting together, bringing together over 100 US-based humanitarian organizations working in Lebanon who have a concern for Lebanon. And we're going to be one of the signatories on a letter going to Congress promoting an expansion of food aid to Lebanon and looking at other ways to help Lebanon. We personally can help each one of our families and stuff, but you know, the reality is you can't send money and assume that your families are going to get it. You can't, you want to make sure that the money goes to organizations that are trustworthy, and you want to make sure that you're having an impact. And so I think that, you know, there's no sure way to do it, but we have to keep, as Mona said earlier, we have to do something now. We can't wait for more suffering to take place. For example, the medical system in Lebanon is a mess. It's barely functioning in terms of supporting places outside of the major cities. There needs to be much more investment in public health. The good thing about US aid is it doesn't go to the government, but we do have to find a strong civil society, NGO sector that we can support through, whether it's allocations of money or fundraising or whichever we can. But that's one of the real functions that we overseas Lebanese have, and our friends in Lebanon, which are vast, is to build up financial resources to these NGOs and civil society organizations. I think Paul Rafael can tell you what Life's been doing. Paul?
Sure. We focused on 3 areas, and we do have a US 501c3 for those of you who are interested. We focus on education, particularly university education, but increasingly primary education and secondary education. We have over 300 scholars at the university level and spending now a lot more money at the primary, secondary. The second area is, as Jean said, we have selected through a rigorous process 7 NGOs that have a national footprint, and we've channeled $1 million to those 7 NGOs. And the third area is maybe to the point of the earlier question around private sector involvement. We're involved in a pretty massive job creation initiative where it doesn't touch the government at all. These are training schools for programmers, and where we then link through a job platform, a job search platform, local programming and local technical skills individuals with global needs through our network. Those are the 3 areas that we are quite active in. There is a US-based organization that we view as a sister organization to Life called SEAL, S-E-A-L, which has also been very successful recently in fundraising. They raised $1 million a month ago on a single webinar. So I invite you to look at SEAL and Life if you're so inclined. Not that I want to plug only those 2 organizations, but certainly we've been trying to do those things in the short term, in addition to our medium and long-term objectives.
so before we go to our last question and turn it over to Paul, let me also inform our audience that ATFL is putting together a humanitarian letter. And it's being organized by our executive director, Leslie Tuma, the purpose of which is to find all the NGOs in America that are trying to help Lebanon, bring them together in a common effort to speak to the United States government about this problem. So it's not an ATFL letter. It's a letter signed by over 100 NGOs giving aid in Lebanon. Life will be a signature to that. And the purpose of it is to basically encourage the government to look at new programs that can provide aid with a real focus on this PL 480. We can deal with tens of millions of dollars if we can get a focus on this, this program. And it's one that's available to the neediest people in the world. So we hope to add to that. The last question goes to Paul and others. Can or will the negotiations with the IMF be put back on track given the resignation of the chief negotiator for Lebanon after he was blocked by the power brokers? Paul, Rafael, in this explanation, explain exactly where the IMF is, where the roadblocks are, and what the Lebanese government has to do to put it on track, please. And then we'll go to Paul.
Sure. Look, the IMF is a key cornerstone to any stabilization and recovery program. It's not because we're all enamored with the IMF. It's just because it's the last and only card. The IMF can grant Lebanon anywhere between, call it 4 billion and 10 billion. The size of the hole in Lebanon is closer to 80 billion and moving very fast towards 100 billion because of the devaluation and the credit deterioration. So 4 to 10 billion is not going to be sufficient, certainly, to plug the hole. But with the IMF come two other things. One is additional funding from other multilaterals and government agencies and governments, as well as I think was mentioned earlier by Congressman Lahoud, the release of more private sector investment. The second thing that comes with the IMF program is conditionality, that the IMF will condition its grants and its loans, mostly loans, to with condition that on certain reforms that we and this paper that we have now we're publishing do also call for. So the IMF is critical. Henri Shaul, the key advisor to the Minister of Finance, and for whatever it's worth, a member of Life, as well as Alain Bifani, who was the long-standing Director General at the Finance Ministry, have both resigned within a couple of days of each other, really in disgust as to the lack of movement and the disbelief, actually, among the ranks of the IMF and the international community, where there's a lot of goodwill for Lebanon, but very, very limited appetite to grant money without some movement on the part of the Lebanese government, which is not happening. So where are we? Unfortunately, there's not good news on that front. I think at a minimum, the central bank and the Ministry of Finance are actually actively speaking to each other. Not often enough, but they're speaking to each other, which is progressed, in order to come up with one set of numbers and one set of strategies to move forward with the IMF, which is now has been recently a precondition. There is some hope. The IMF has not turned its back on Lebanon. There is some hope that those discussions will reopen. Unfortunately, those meetings are happening once a week when they should be happening 24/7. So it's snail's pace, but we should continue to beat the drum around the need to progress on the IMF. As I said, it is a cornerstone.
Thank you, Paul. Well, we have 24 remaining questions, which we're not going to get to, but our two websites, mei.edu and atfl.org. We will take your questions, begin a conversation with you. And I'd now like to turn it over to Paul Salem, who will conclude this meeting. And I want to thank our presenters today as well. Paul?
Yeah, thank you, Ed. Yeah, I want to also say sorry that we didn't get to all these excellent questions, but our time is limited. Our team will transcribe these questions and email them to our panelists and hope to get as many answers back to you as we can. I want to, say the key thing is go ahead and see the report, read the report, share the report. I'm talking to the audience. This report will be updated as developments require, and certainly MEI here in DC, as well as ATFL and Life internationally, will remain engaged with each other. and with decision makers both in Lebanon and around the world to try to move things in a positive direction as best we can. That we will, while focusing on the longer term necessary structural reforms, also have a very urgent emphasis on the many humanitarian emergencies that we've all talked about. So I want to thank everybody who joined us from around the world, this either on Zoom or on our live stream on YouTube. I want to thank Ed and Jean and the entire American Task Force for Lebanon team for everything you do in general and for cooperation on this report. I want to thank LIFE for its valuable work for and in Lebanon, for its cooperation in this effort, and for the cooperation that LIFE and MEI are building to work more intensively on Lebanon. I thank Paul Rafael for being with us. Thank you, Congressman Lahoud, for leading the Lebanon Congress and for all you do for Lebanon and for representing, at least from Peoria, the many Lebanese you have there. But we all have so many relatives around the world, and certainly many of them in the US. Lebanon is indeed a globalized country, so we're all in this together. And thank you, Mona, for all you do for Lebanon and for joining us today. Thank you, everybody, and we hope to see you again at a future webinar.